26 is the underlying problems with the American economy before the great crash of 1929. This lesson looks at five particular things. It's a bit of a long one, but we'll get through it. There are why, if you looked under the surface of the Roaring Twenties, there were several signs that, let's just say, things weren't that amazing. The first one, of course, is the massive uneven distribution of wealth. It should come as no surprise. This is an American thing. This is an American thing of the Gilded Age. To the best of the progressive efforts, it was still a thing during the Progressive era, and it's a massive problem in the 1920s. You've also got an issue of rural poverty. You have people trying to buy into the American dream, getting into what are known as get-rich-quick schemes, and getting conned out of huge amounts of money. Couple that with the problems in the banking system and problems of easy credit, and the fact that America, though it becomes really the first international economy, gets involved in a rather complex cycle of international debt with some, let's just call it some countries that can't pay, Germany. Anyhow, uneven distribution of wealth. What does that mean? So, as we've said, the difference between the A and the B in this course is making sure that you understand that it is not all one way or the other. Some regions enjoyed prosperity quite a bit more than others, and the regions won't surprise you. The areas along the East Coast and the Northeast and the Midwest were actually relatively prosperous during the 1920s. On the other hand, those in the South, across the plains, were very much not. And I'll give you some numbers on that shortly. Unemployment at this time was high and jobs were unstable. Much of the jobs that were out there were short term, for instance, picking during crop season. Many other sections of society were better off than others. Men did better than women. Women, for example, didn't share in the prosperity that their male counterparts did, though in the 1920s is sometimes looked at as a time of women's liberation. That's really an example of what potentially could be, but only a very few small group of women ever become flappers and enjoy the scene in New York City or Boston or whatever it happens to be. Ethnic groups, more particularly African Americans and Native Americans, suffered dramatically. African Americans moved to the north in large numbers to go to the large urban centers and hope of a better life, to find it different than the South, and are horribly, horribly disappointed. So that's key on that distribution of income thing I was talking about. In the Northeast and the West, they enjoy the highest per capita income. So when I talk about the West, I'm predominantly talking about California. In 1929, the average income was $921 for somebody, and in the Northeast, and $881 in the West. It's quite a lot of money. However, compare that with the Southeast. I'm talking about Georgia, Florida, Alabama. You're looking at about $365. South Carolina, which is also in the Southeast, was as low as $129 as the average income for an American citizen. In 1929, the Brookings Institute found that things were actually becoming more equal. And famously, two sociologists, Lind and Lind, studied at the town of Muncie, Indiana, a town which is known as Middletown. And they found in Muncie, Indiana, something that we'll look at greater in class, that 75% of people in Muncie, Indiana earn less than the amount the Federal Bureau of Labor recommended as the minimum income required to support themselves. In old industries, the ones that were set up in the Northeast, I'm thinking about coal, iron, steel, they started to see some new challenges in the 1920s, which cut into their profits. In some cases, that is. Coal, for instance, saw challenges from new energy sources like electricity and oil. Cotton, really the principal crop of the South, demand for that lessened dramatically due to the creation of synthetic fibers like polyester and rayon, and fashion changes like shorter skirts requiring actually less material decreased world demand on cotton. Factories in the Northeast found that the wages that they had to put their people meant that they were pay their people rather, meant that they were less competitive. Also, rules that were coming in the progressive era governing the amount of hours one can work. Limited how much, I suppose, a factory could produce. Railways will suffer. The birth of the motor car and the associated trucking or lorry industry means that railways and their really absolute dominance over internal trade and internal movement of people begins to wane at this time. From this point onwards, railways are a story of steady decline. The Northeast in the general, though, despite all of these challenges, will fare pretty well, mostly because many new industries such as the motor car industry and the associated industries of rubber and tire making and on and on and onwards, are drawn to the Northeast. A, for the ready supply of cheap immigrant labor. B, because of the already developed transport links and their high populations and access to natural resources. And of course, we see, again in this context, very few of these new industries decide to relocate themselves to the South and the Southwest. So in many, in essence, and in a lot of cases, not that much changed. The stability of unemployment was way down. And of course, that's talk about the fluctuating demand, something I alluded to earlier. Back to Middletown for a second. During the first 9 months of 1924, in that particular town, Lyndon Lind found that 72% of people had been unemployed at some stage or another. 43% of those were jobless for over a month. And this is a time when there's absolutely no welfare. So the American worker really, really, really lived a sort of a precarious lifestyle, even though they do have the appearance of riding high. Women, for instance, in the 1930s, only 150 women dentists, and this is supposed to be a time of great emancipation. In 1928, only 145 women held seats in state legislatures, and only 2 women were represented in Congress whatsoever. There were more jobs for women, but those jobs were pretty limited. Clerical work, in some cases, salespeople predominantly like department stores and so forth. But these remain relatively low paid. So yes, women do enter the workforce, but they're not moving up. They're not making the money. They're not certainly not doing managerial roles in any great number. There are almost no female industrialists. There are no relatively few managing directors. And let's pretend for a second that a woman and a man did the same job. It was common, as it still is in some cases, unfortunately, that women and men receive different sums of money for their work. Women receiving less, that of course. So yeah, the image of the fun-loving woman, the flapper, for instance, which is common in the 1920s, grew, but women were generally expected to concentrate on marriage and housemaking still. It's probably a myth to say that the 1920s was a time of more opportunity for women, and there was a chance for them to get to the top. Not to mention the fact that legislation did little to help women. Women's groups, feminist organizations in the 1920s complained about 2 particular things. Number one, even though the Shepard-Townes Act of 1921 did provide women with health care for pregnancy. So as I was saying, the Shepard-Townes Act gave health care for pregnancy. Think that's a pretty good thing. But feminists actually thought it reinforced the role of women and mothers and was actually detrimental to women improving themselves. There was legislation that comes down in the 1920s banning women from doing night shift work. And this was pretty much attacked as well because, women who couldn't work nights ended up losing their jobs because some companies needed to work a 24-hour shift. The former suffragette, Alice Paul, you'll remember her, she was the one who protested the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson, set up what was known as the National Women's Party. But women never really vote for this party because they never vote as a bloc, and they remain a relatively fragmented group of society, tending to follow their husbands' political leanings when it comes time to use the votes that they had earned in at the end of the Progressive era. For Native and African Americans, the existence was pretty miserable. Natives live a miserable existence on infertile reservations, oftentimes having to borrow, beg, and steal money, or money and food just to survive. African Americans, which make about 10% of the population, but are still 85% living in the South, the most poor region of the United States, start to move to the north in increasing numbers. But as they move to the north with hopes for a better life to get, part of their American dream, they found that they faced the same discrimination, and considerably so, in housing, in employment. As a result, African Americans tend to ghettoize themselves in areas of the cities, some of the poorer urban areas, Harlem, New York, for example, the south side of Chicago. And as a result, these people live in overcrowded areas with poor living conditions, and this really adds to their problems. We'll talk about the Harlem Renaissance and social change because Black people there will be a pushback in the 20s that is quite profound, however, and culturally symbolic. But nevertheless, it doesn't necessarily do a lot to shift attitudes towards Black people. In the 1920s, we also see the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, the famous anti-white nationalist, anti-black organization that will reform, and not only reform, come back in new, dynamic, and ever-growing ways. The Ku Klux Klan will become one of the biggest membership organizations in the United States. 14% of them, so rather, and I'll sort of got confused. But anyway, the last point I want to make is that 14% of farmers in the United States during a time of suffering for farmers when their fortunes are generally poor were African American. The second point of our 5 is rural poverty, and this sort of links to the fact that I just made, that farmers had it rough. In the 1920s and 1920s, for the first time, America became an urban nation. There were more people living in urban areas than in rural areas. The USA had really been founded on hard work, really the values of rural America: farming, independence, entrepreneurship. The influence of the farm lobby, as we had learned, was quite powerful through the end of the Gilded Age. Think of the Populist Party and the fact that the progressives were shaped so much by the demands of the farmer, either that is over the greenback or over the tariff. The influence of the farm lobby starts to wane in the 1920s and gets really threatened by urban interests. As more people live in the city, there's more impetus for politicians to live, or listen to rather, those in the city. During World War I, farmers did well. Prices rose. In fact, the government encouraged and gave incentives to farmers to grow huge amounts of foods that could be sold overseas to their allies, the British, the French, or on the other hand, to feed the American army overseas. However, in the 1920s, when these sort of incentives go away, you get a double whammy of them going away, coupled with prohibition, which cuts demand for grain. That also means that in the 1920s, as Americans actually achieve, in some cases, higher living standards, one of the interesting connections between higher living standards is your consumption of meat. When you're poorer, you eat a lot of grains. When you're richer, you eat a lot of meat. And that's generally how people, what people do. And as a consequence of that, the demand for grain goes down, which is the principal staple crop of the American farmer. As I had mentioned earlier, synthetic fibers, polyester rayon, loosen the grip of, or loosen the, reduce, let's just say, the demand for cotton, the principal crop of the southeastern United States. Additionally, at the same time, while demand is going down, technological advances such as the tractor, the thresher, the grain harvester, mean that Americans are producing way more than they ever have. In fact, they produce so much that the Americans end up taking 13 million acres of arable farmland out of production because it's producing way more than they need. The Americans are letting grain rot rather than being able to sell it. Farmers effectively become too efficient and produce too much. And paradoxically, that means that farms suffer. By the end of the 1920s, 66% of American farms were operating at a loss. Now, with not only operating a loss and getting themselves attached to huge amounts of debt to buy the things that they need in order to farm efficiently, that means when the Great Depression hits, farmers will be affected very, very badly as those loans are defaulted on and or recalled. The role of government in this, well, it's a combination of good and bad. The government does a lot of things that actually make the situation worse. Tariffs, for instance, protect industry but not agriculture. Government policy was to encourage farmers to work together to market their produce. They back things known as a cooperative, where farmers work together, join their money together, and increase their buying power. They passed what's known as the Agricultural Credits Act of 23, which funds 12 intermediate credit banks to lend to farmers. But in reality, though, the government wants to be able to allow farmers to get access to bankers' money, the last thing they need is more debt. Large agricultural producers could access these loans and produce more effectively, but the small farmers get squeezed out. So again, you see that even in some cases, the best intentions actually squeeze the little guy out. The good, there's an Emergency Tariff Act, which lowers tariffs on certain produce, which means that there is less retaliatory tariffs, which means that Americans can sell grain abroad, for instance. The Ford-Necumber Act, both of these will either reduce tariffs on imported goods or place high tariffs on food imports. And since foreign markets retaliate in a lot of cases, Americans do still have some trouble selling their surpluses abroad. The reality, if you want to face it, is American farmers, and this is a sort of a cold way of looking at it, needed to realize that they had to move away from farming, and that the sort of the technological advances were meaning that fewer and fewer people actually needed to farm. But in reality, that's little comfort to those that are having their lifestyles altered by sort of economic realities that they don't understand nor want to truly address. The big issue, of course, and I've alluded to this already, is overproduction. Too much food and prices are low. Farmers are reluctant to underproduce voluntarily in order to not flood the market because they couldn't really trust their neighbors to do the same. So farmers, and in the end, wanted government to buy their surpluses at what they called a parity price, a price given so that they would at least not lose money on their surpluses. But the government really wouldn't do that. The furthest thing they do is set up the Maneri-Hagen Bill of 1924, which is an agricultural export commission. And this was sort of this idea that would promote American overproduction of well, whatever the Americans overproduce, it would be promoted abroad, and the Americans would go out and actively try and find foreign markets for food that was produced. However, President Calvin Coolidge, after it had been passed through Congress successfully twice, vetoes the bill twice. Coolidge basically says that it failed to address the overall question of overproduction and farmers should just produce less. He felt that dumping American food abroad would lead to poor foreign relations, especially with his European friends, and it would create a bureaucratic nightmare. In other words, attempting to coordinate all of this would make the government too big, and it would require the work of thousands and thousands of businesses, which he wasn't prepared to do. It was also, he said, based on the shaky assumption that foreign markets would stay open to cheap American food. But, and I think I was probably right on that. If Americans start flooding the market with cheap food, they're probably just going to shut down the market to protect their own farmers. So Coolidge maybe had a point in this respect. Anyways, what we see is despite whatever efforts were made, more and more farmers go bankrupt and lose everything. And farmers become a very, very, very bitter lot indeed. So the 1920s, in regards to farming, see really the death of the small farmers. Large-scale cereal production and fruit production businesses such as Del Monte or Kellogg's form, and they use the techniques of mass production and an industry to and sort of business engineering to become some of the largest agricultural firms in the world. But these guys, of course, because they're using new machines, they require actually very little labor apart from the harvest time. So what we see is that big companies do well, but small ones go. Now, so what did the little guy do? Well, one of the things and the solutions in the 1920s was to get involved in get-rich-quick schemes. Okay, easy credit, the ability to borrow money on a whim from a bank. It was assumed, of course, because nobody had really borrowed in great deals before, that everyone's credit was good. So the fact that people could borrow huge amounts of monies in the 1920s was generally a good thing because it increased consumerism, which increased the amount of people bought from American producers. But on the flip side, it had its drawbacks. A get-rich-quick scheme, and getting rich quick for that matter, was the aim of a lot of Americans. So they invest wildly in the 1920s, and incredibly stupidly, if I'm going to be honest here. And this meant that crooks, such as the famous Charles Ponzi, could take advantage of everybody's greed. Ponzi himself had been a former vegetable seller, and he cons thousands of Americans into investing into his fake ventures. He promises them that they'll get a 50% return on their investment within 90 days, and people pour hundreds of thousands of dollars into Charles Ponzi's fake companies. When these are turned out to be a fake and people lose all of their money, Charles Ponzi's charged with fraud. And when sentenced, the judge actually criticized his victims instead of Ponzi for being so greedy that they allowed such a stupid man such as Charles Ponzi to get away with it. Other large-scale speculations include the Florida land boom and the stock exchange, which would actually lead to massive problems in regards to the Great Depression, but we'll investigate these in later lessons. These large-scale speculations draw huge investments into, effectively, companies that are valueless, for lack of a better term. The banking system. The U.S. banking system was pretty much out of date by the 1920s, even though things like the Federal Reserve and the had only been created in 1913. The Reserve Bank system wasn't able to meet with the new and complex economy of the 1920s. In approximately 7 years, it's already behind the times. Basically, what happens is these reserve banks only represent the interests of bankers. They couldn't really be relied on to act in the best interests of the people or the nation. Okay, and as a result, they do things which actually hurt the nation. So during the Great Depression, when people need more money, they limit the amount of currency that goes out there. They hold their money. They don't allow people to withdraw, and this makes the effects of the Great Depression much, much worse. One of the other things, the fact is that the only a few national banks ever were required to join the Federal Reserve System. Today, every bank must join the national bank system. In the United States at this particular time, there are 30,000 banks. Most of them are small, most of them are rural, and if a financial panic hits, they're unable to cope. This was the case in the Gilded Age as well, and it's still the system in the 1920s. The Federal Reserve simply just didn't have enough reach over rural banks. The Federal Reserve also wanted to keep the market booming, so they favored low interest rates, which increased the amount of people borrowed. This left, of course, people dangerously, dangerously indebted. The last point I'm going to make is that of the cycle of international debt. It's really at the heart of the economic problems in the USA, and really probably the biggest thing, which means the Great Depression gets worse and worse and worse. America's priority at the end of the First World War was to get every cent it had lent to the Allies back. When countries had trouble paying their loans back, Americans were unsympathetic, even though many could not afford to repay their loans. In 1922, Congress created the Debt Funding Commission. It suggested the minimum deadline for repayment from all of the allies they had lent to should be 1947, and that they should pay at a rate of 4.25%. Pretty much too high for them. The problem is high tariffs made it worse. European countries couldn't afford to pay their debts because they couldn't export to America. And as a result, the world's largest economy was barred from France, barred from Britain, and their debts were effectively unpayable. So what America ends up doing is making all sorts of little special agreements, okay, backing down on the Debt Funding Commission's recommendation. For instance, Britain gets a special agreement to repay their loan. They had borrowed 4.6 billion American dollars for the First World War, and they get a chance to pay this over 62 years at 3.3%. And other countries as well get bespoke deals. The biggest problem beyond that was Germany. You'll recall perhaps that the Americans lent huge amounts of money to the Germans in the Dawes and the Young plans of 1920, having to do with reparations in the Treaty of Versailles. The European victors effectively took the money that the Germans had lent, or the Americans had lent the Germans, and the Germans had then thus paid to the French, the Belgians, and the British, and then given it back to the Americans. Okay, so in effect, the Dawes and the Young plan meant the United States was paying themselves back. So no one gains in this situation. The United States isn't getting any real money back. They're just getting back money that they had lent anyway. So no, what happens is, the United States has huge international debts, and these debts are almost like an anchor weight on the economy, and will provide, if the American economy slows down, this will be very, very problematic. It was said by Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury in 1925, that the United States would have been better if they had taken the money out of the Treasury building and put it in another. Most American investment in Europe took place in Germany. And that was super problematic, as you know. Germany wasn't necessarily the most economically stable country in the 1920s, if you think back to your previous learning at GCSE. Overinvestment was a huge problem. Wall Street bankers made massive profits for connecting investors with German businesses looking for investment. Corruption was common. For instance, a concern interested in building swimming pools in Bavaria that cost around $125,000 in total saw $3 million in American investment. And they just blew it. What all this meant was Germany and reparations and the way that Americans were lending to Germany made America's tangle of international debt more and more complex. So with all of this will, as we'll see, sort of come to a head. Will come to a head as the economy begins to slow. And by the late 1920s, there was lots of signs that the boom of the 1920s was slowing down. if you were willing to look. Firstly, there were small business issues. Smaller businesses were facing hard times. Foreclosures and bankruptcies increased. For every 4 businesses that succeeded in America, 3 failed. Motor vehicle companies start to fall. This had been really one of the engines of American growth. There were 108 in 1920 and only 44 by 1930. The rest had either been merged or gone out of business. In the construction industry, which is generally probably the best indicator of the health of the economy, after 1926, demand tails off. This fall in demand meant there were less need for building materials, skilled tradesmen such as plumbers, electricians, and the transportation of materials. So all of the associated industries start to fall apart. Unemployment rises. Couple this with the third point. With unemployment rising, you get a fall in domestic demand. By 1928, production outstrips demand. The market is flooded with goods that could be sold. America, could not be sold. By April 1929, 10% of Philadelphia, one of America's largest cities, and a city of industry on the East Coast, is at 10%. 80% of Americans, if you want to look at, are living close to what we consider the subsistence line. That is, they only make enough money for them to survive. Even, that means, when they were in work. The last couple points. Some people will argue, well, why didn't the Americans turn to unions? And this is a time when actually union membership goes down. Really, they're little help. Large companies realized that the best way to union-proof, or to keep a union out of your company, was to practice what they called welfare capitalism. So in the biggest of companies, they granted their people pensions. Vacation and service awards were given to workers. It must be said, though, that this was only true of the largest companies in the United States. Union membership and strike activity drops, and people place their faith in companies over the union. This was really detrimental to, had detrimental long-term consequences. What we need to remember here is that in the 1920s, no matter who you worked for, no one in any company had anything resembling job security. So what's the overall analysis? And we're almost done. It's pretty easy to see with hindsight that there were huge issues. People didn't really have a detailed understanding how a sophisticated economy works. Those, for instance, who expressed concerns about the coming collapse had little influence. Historians like Brogan will argue at every stage the story displays devastating consequences, or the devastating consequences of a bland awareness of economic and political essentials. Other historians, such as Arthur Schlesinger Jr., are really critical of the inactivity of government for not taking strides to protect the American economy or to protect people from their own stupidity. Other economic historians have been less critical. Basically, they say, realistically, no matter what, if you looked across the world, the United States economy is doing great, especially compared to their European neighbors. The capitalist system, which the United States economy was based on, was strong. So strong that it survived the worst economic collapse and the Great Depression. And many of the big companies in the 1920s still work today. Okay, we think about the large blue chip companies in the United States. Most of those companies are still here, and maybe not doing everything they did in the 1920s, but they're still here. And for those arguments, some people say maybe it's a little bit too hard to judge them. Anyway, that's what we're looking at, and we see that there are quite a few problems below the surface. You can probably sum this one up as farmers had it bad. But anyways, it's more complex than that, as usual.